In the year 1826, somewhere beyond the windswept Dakota territory, a man pulled an old leather bag closer to a campfire, already beginning to fade. Night fell quickly across the plains, cold enough that even the hand holding his knife had started to stiffen. Inside the bag there was no warm bread, no fragrant coffee, nothing resembling a proper supper. Only a hard cracker broken along one edge, a little parched corn resting at the bottom of a cloth sack, several strips of smoked-dried meat, and a lump of white fat carefully wrapped in rawhide to keep it from melting away. Beyond the darkness behind him, wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like old paper rubbing together. Out there, the nearest civilization was still many days away on horseback, and food was no longer a matter of taste, when civilizations was still thousands of mills away. Beside his mud-covered boots rested a leather journal whose edges had curled from dampness and smoke. When opened, yellowed pages appeared beneath the firelight, carrying faded ink written hastily during a distant evening long ago. Fort Union, 1831. Pemmican, dried venison, bear fat. There were no elaborate recipes, no beautiful descriptions. Only a few names were written down because those foods had once helped someone survive another winter. The man keeping that journal did not resemble a cook standing inside a family kitchen. He seemed more like someone raised beside frontier campfires, beside journeys lasting weeks without seeing a single town, and beside supply sacks permanently carrying the smell of smoke. He understood that out across the Rocky Mountain plains and the old fur-trading routes, even a little cornmeal left at the bottom of a sack still held value. A strip of dried meat hanging near the smoke might suggest whether a man still had enough strength to saddle a horse the following morning. Tonight's video will contain a bowl of cornmeal porridge that once carried entire groups through heavy snow seasons. There will be dried meat that survived for weeks inside leather bags and remained edible. There will be buffalo fat guarded almost like money itself. There will be organ meats that restaurants in St. Louis now sell for high prices, even though frontier people once treated them as rare rewards after many days of hunger and cold. And at the end of the journey comes the number one food, something that appears completely ordinary, yet many mountain people once believed that, without it, they would never have had enough strength to cross the Rocky Mountains. Out on the frontier, food was never simply about filling the stomach. It steadied trembling hands against the cold wind and gave people enough strength to build one more fire before darkness completely arrived. Tonight, the old leather journal is opened once again. Pull your chair closer to the fire. 25 meals begin with the number 25. The dry ration bag, cheap, hard, but life-saving. A hard cracker snapped in half beside the fire with a dry cracking sound like a rotten branch breaking beneath a horse's hoof. Out across the dark prairie, the wind continued moving through the cold grass with a thin, whistling sound like old paper scraping together. Inside the leather bag resting beside the saddle, the remaining food for the entire week consisted of only a few simple things. Hard biscuits cracked along the edges, a little parched corn coated with yellow dust at the bottom of a cloth sack, and enough cornmeal to cook into a thin pot of porridge. Nobody would have called those foods delicious. But on the frontier during the early 19th century, they were worth far more than they appeared to be. Number 25 was hardtack, something found on nearly every long journey between Missouri and the Rocky Mountains during the 1830s. At trading posts in St. Louis or Independence, a portion of hardtack often cost only around 3 to 5 cents, while a large barrel capable of lasting many weeks could cost about $1.25. People stored them in leather bags because soft bread spoiled too quickly in rain, cold weather, and endless travel. Some pieces became so hard that men had to strike them with the handle of a knife just to break them apart. When eaten, They were soaked in black coffee, soup, or hot water to soften them before being spread with a little bear fat or buffalo grease, if any still remained inside the ration bag. Out on the frontier, a cracker that could still be chewed was always better than an empty stomach. Number 24 was parched corn, something far cheaper than meat yet capable of carrying a person almost an entire day farther if rationed carefully. Around the year 1832, along supply posts beside the Missouri River, a pound of parched corn usually cost only 2 or 3 cents. Men poured it into cracked, freezing hands and chewed it directly while riding horseback. If there was time to stop, they crushed it into smaller pieces and cooked it with water or mixed it with whatever hot grease still remained inside the cooking pot. There were weeks when game animals disappeared from the prairie completely, and entire groups traveled many extra miles through bitter wind with only a few handfuls of corn left at the bottom of their cloth bags. During days like that, even a handful of corn became precious. Number 23 was sagamite, a hot meal commonly found among French-Canadian fur trading groups and indigenous communities throughout the Great Plains around the year 1834. A large pot for an entire group often cost only 6 to 8 cents, using cornmeal, water, and a little grease or scraps of meat if any remained. People poured the meal into hot water and stirred it slowly beside a low fire with wooden spoons until the pot thickened. If they were lucky enough to have scraps of meat left, they added them at the end so the pot would carry a stronger smell. In many small frontier camps, a hot pot of sagamite became the final thing keeping warmth inside the body before everyone wrapped themselves in blankets beside the fire and waited for the next morning to arrive. Pemmican and wasna, food preserved with fat, meat, and thyme. Some foods did not need to be hot to save lives. A piece of pemmican sliced open in the middle of a freezing wind could sometimes be worth more than an entire pot of soup boiling beside the fire. During the early 1830s, at fur trading rendezvous points along the Missouri and Dakota territories, people bargained for gunpowder, traps, wool blankets, and black coffee. But whenever a good bag of pemmican arrived in camp, few men asked how good it tasted. They asked how much remained, because out on the frontier, there were days when a person's survival rested entirely inside, something tightly wrapped with sinew inside a smoke-stained leather bag. Number 22 was pemmican, the food that traveled beside countless groups crossing frozen plains and endless roads without towns. Around the year 1833, at trading posts throughout the Missouri region, pemmican could cost around $2 per pound, hardly inexpensive at a time when a fine beaver pelt might sell for only $5 or $6. Buffalo meat was dried until almost every trace of moisture disappeared, then crushed into fibers using stones. Fat was melted slowly inside a small pot beside the fire and poured carefully across the shredded meat. If chokecherries or dried berries were available, they were mixed in last before everything was packed tightly into rawhide bags. Pemmican was not beautiful food. It was dense, heavily scented with meat, and left grease across a man's hands. But a good bag could survive for weeks through bitter wind, all remain edible. During many journeys across the Rocky Mountains, people valued pemmican not because of its flavor, but because it provided more time to stay alive. There were mornings when snow reached nearly to the knees, game animals vanished from sight for days, and entire groups survived by dividing tiny slices of pemmican just to keep their legs moving forward. Number 21 was wasna, carrying a completely different smell from pemmican from the very moment hot fat touched dried berries. Around the year 1835, in the Lakota and Dakota communities throughout the Great Plains, wasna was often prepared for winter seasons and long journeys. Dried meat was crushed with stone pestles, berries were mashed into pulp, and everything was mixed by hand with hot fat before being pressed into portions. The smell of smoked meat, blending with the gentle sweetness of dried fruit, created a strange and unforgettable scent against the freezing prairie wind. Many mountain people remember it was not because of how it looked. They remembered the feeling of someone cutting them a portion during the bitter cold, when hands had already gone stiff and the fire was beginning to die. Some foods are remembered by the winters they carried people through, and wasna was one of them. Dried meat, smoke, and the foods saved for tomorrow. A small camp on the frontier often smelled of smoke before the fire itself could even be seen. Smoke clung to deerskin clothing hanging beside wooden stakes, clung to hair, blankets rolled on the ground, and strips of meat swaying near the low roof of a tent. Night fell quickly and cold across the prairie. One man usually remained awake to keep the red coals from dying completely, because on the early 19th century frontier, killing an animal was not the hardest part. Keeping the meat from spoiling was the real skill. Number 20 was dried venison, something commonly found around trading settlements along the Missouri River around the year 1831. A pound of dried venison at that time could trade for around 18 to 25 cents, depending on whether hunting season had been good or poor. Men used long knives to cut the meat into thin strips so wind could pass through more easily. If salt remained available, they rubbed a little onto the surface before hanging the meat from leather cords beside low fires. The dark red strips slowly curled along the edges beneath smoke and time until weeks later they could still be eaten during long journeys through cold country. Fresh meat could fill a stomach for one night. Dried meat was what carried people through many more days afterward. Number 19 was smoked whitefish, something often found near cold lakes and dark northern streams around the Rockies during the year 1834. A well-smoked batch of fish could trade for 30 to 40 cents at frontier posts if the flesh remained dry enough to last. The fish were split open and hung across low wooden racks beside glowing coals. Whoever tended the fire had to keep damp wood burning slowly so the smoke moved gently through the flesh instead of scorching it too quickly. During some nights, fish oil dripped onto the coals with soft crackling sounds for hours beneath the freezing wind. A man often stayed awake nearly the entire night, turning the fish, controlling the fire, and watching the color of the smoke shifting beneath the dark tent roof. Slow smoke preserves food longer, and out on the frontier, patience could be almost as valuable as food itself. Number 18 was smoked buffalo meat hanging inside tents, something carrying the unmistakable smell of the Great Plains around the year 1835. A pound of well-smoked buffalo meat at that time could be worth 35 to 50 cents because it traveled far more easily than fresh meat and lasted much longer. People hung strips close to the roof of the tent where the smoke gathered thickest, then maintained small fires for many hours so the meat dried slowly without becoming bitter. The smell of buffalo meat mixed with sage smoke filled the air, clung to jacket sleeves, and settled into blankets spread beside the fire. When winter began moving closer, many people guarded those carefully smoked strips more closely than sugar or coffee. There were winters on the frontier when simply smelling smoke inside the tent was enough to remind people they still had food for tomorrow. Fat, the white gold of the frontier. There were nights cold enough for water to freeze into thin white edges around tin cups resting beside the fire. Wind slipped through the cracks of tents with a sound thin and sharp enough to feel like knives cutting against the skin. During nights like those, frontier people of the early 19th century did not look at fat with the disgust many modern kitchens would later develop. They looked at it as extra days of survival. A block of white fat lying beside a leather ration bag could calm an entire camp more than a small sack of flour, because on the frontier, lean meat filled the stomach quickly, but fat was what helped the body survive a long winter. Number 17 was roasted bone marrow, something often treated as a cheap leftover in St. Louis around the year 1832. A large marrow bone from cattle or buffalo at that time might cost only 4 to 6 cents. But in small camps scattered across the prairie, very few people abandoned bones that still held marrow inside. Men smashed the bones hard against rocks until they cracked open, then placed them beside hot coals. Before long, soft golden marrow began appearing through the cracks amid smoke and freezing air. They scooped the hot marrow out with knives or wooden spoons, spread it across hard biscuits, or ate it directly beside the fire. Some foods looked far poorer than their true value. Bone marrow was one of them. Number 16 was rendered bear fat, carrying a heavy, wild smell that filled tents while it cooked. Around the year 1834, a gallon of good bear grease at Missouri trading posts could sell for $1.50 to $2, nearly equal to several days of labor wages. People chopped the fat into small chunks and cooked it slowly inside cast iron pots until it melted down completely. The clear liquid fat was strained through cloth before being poured into tin containers or leather bags to be preserved for winter. Bear grease was used to fry bread, mix with cornmeal, soften leather, and rub across hands cracked from cold weather. In many small camps, one good pot of fat could help carry an entire group through snowstorms and bitter winds. Number 15 was depuyer, the prized back fat of female buffalo during autumn hunts. When a buffalo was brought down on the Great Plains around the year 1835, many hunters saved the fat before even cutting the finest meat. A large portion could trade for 60 to 75 cents because its true value rested in its ability to help the body hold heat through long winters. People cut it into blocks, kept it whole, or melted it down to eat with dried meat, corn, and hard biscuits. Out on the frontier, there were winters when fat became more valuable than meat itself. When snow began piling thick around low tents, and wind swept across the dark prairie, a piece of fat carried inside, a leather bag could sometimes be the only thing giving a man enough strength to rise again the next morning. No part was thrown away. When a deer or buffalo was brought down on the cold prairie, frontier people of the early 19th century did not gather around looking only for the finest cuts of meat. The liver was usually removed before darkness completely settled in. The heart was placed beside glowing coals the very same night as the hunt, and the large tongue, something many modern kitchens would quickly ignore, was carefully saved for a stew that would simmer until morning. Out on the frontier, food spoiled faster than pride, so almost no part of an animal was wasted if it could help someone stay fed for another day. Number 14 was pan-fried venison liver, carrying a strong smell the moment it touched hot cast iron. Around the year 1831 in St. Louis, liver and many organ meats were often sold for only 3 to 5 cents because they were considered less valuable than loin cuts or ribs. But in small hunting camps along the Missouri River, liver was often the first thing eaten. Men sliced thick pieces and seared them quickly in hot grease with onions if they were lucky enough to still have a little dried onion left inside their packs. The sound of grease spitting against the skillet in the freezing air created a heavy smell with a faint metallic sharpness impossible to mistake. Many people ate liver almost immediately after the hunt while it was still at its hottest and softest. Out on the frontier, taste mattered less than whether food could still be eaten at all. Number 13 was buffalo heart roasted over coals, something wealthy traders at frontier settlements often considered a cheap leftover around the year 1834. A buffalo or cattle heart at that time usually cost only 6 to 9 cents. Yet during long journeys across the Great Plains, the heart was rarely abandoned. People cut thick slices, skewered them onto wooden sticks, and roasted them quickly beside glowing coals. When fat from the heart dripped onto the fire with soft crackling sounds beneath the dark wind, nearly everyone in camp knew supper had begun. If there happened to be salt and a little black pepper left, it already felt like a far better meal than many from the previous days. There were frontier suppers where simply having hot food was enough to make people feel calmer again. Number 12 was slow-braised beef tongue, a dish requiring far more patience than many other cuts. Around the year 1835, beef tongue at Western markets often sold for 10 to 15 cents, far cheaper than prime cuts, yet enough to feed several people together. The tongue was boiled first, then slowly braised with onions and broth inside a deep cast iron pot resting beside a low fire for many hours. By the time the outer skin loosened and the meat softened enough to cut with a spoon, the entire tent had filled with heavy steam and the smell of hot meat. The cheapest foods were often the ones demanding the most time, and on the frontier, a slow fire could soften even the toughest piece of meat before morning arrived. Wild greens, roots, and the foods growing outside the tent. There were weeks on the frontier when the prairie became so quiet that people stopped looking toward the mountains for game and began looking down toward the ground instead. Wind still moved through the dry grass. Streams still flowed cold behind the tents, but the bags of meat hanging near the smoke had grown noticeably lighter. And during days like those, supper sometimes began with a hand digging through damp soil, a handful of greens growing beside the water, or wild onions pulled from freezing mud. On the early 19th century frontier, the people who survived the longest were often the ones who understood what could still be eaten after the rain. Number 11 was roasted camas root, something commonly found throughout the Northwest around the year 1833. A sack of dried camas at that time might trade for 12 to 18 cents at small trading posts. People used short knives or bare hands to dig through damp earth and pull the small bulbs hidden deep beneath the soil. After being washed clean, they were buried beneath hot coals for many hours until the inside softened and released a gentle sweetness similar to roasted potatoes. There were failed hunting seasons that lasted so long that meat nearly disappeared from camp entirely, and camas roots became the thing keeping stomachs from remaining empty too long. Some frontier suppers were growing directly beneath people's feet the entire time. Number 10 was wild greens simmered in fat, a meal carrying the feeling of early spring after a brutal winter. Around the year 1834, many wild greens cost almost nothing except the labor required to gather them, though the fat used for cooking could still be worth 4 to 6 cents. Because fat always remained precious in cold weather, people gathered greens beside streams and washed them repeatedly until the dirt disappeared before dropping them into small cast iron pots. Hot grease slowly softened the leaves beneath wooden spoons while their bitter smell mellowed, and dried onions were added last if any remained. In many small camps, the first pot of hot greens after a long snow season made entire groups feel strength slowly returning to their bodies. Sometimes, spring began with a pot quietly simmering beside a low fire. Number 9 was wild onions with cornbread, a meal that made an entire tent feel more like a real kitchen than any dried meat ever could. Around the year 1832, a small portion of cornbread cost only 3 to 4 cents worth of cornmeal and grease, while wild onions could be gathered freely from damp prairie grass or beside cold streams. People mixed cornmeal with water and pressed it onto hot cast iron until the bread turned golden with crisp edges. Wild onions were chopped and scattered across the surface while the bread still steamed. The smell of hot onions filling a low tent against the dark wind made the place feel less like a temporary camp in the wilderness. There were nights on the frontier when simply smelling onions Cooking was enough to make people feel a little closer to something called home, when hunger changed everything. There were winters beyond the Rockies when snow fell for so many days that people stopped asking what tasted good and began asking what could still carry them through another week. Cold winds slipped through the seams of tents, forcing fires to burn lower, while nearly empty sacks of cornmeal rested against animal hide walls. Outside, horses stood motionless beneath pale frost. In many frontier journals from the early 19th century, hunger did not arrive loudly. It arrived slowly, colder, and far more quietly than most people imagined. It began when meat pots contained mostly water, when men started looking differently at the leather straps holding saddles together, when a working horse was led closer to the fire. Nobody wished to speak very much after that. Number 8 was horse meat stew, something appearing almost exclusively during failed journeys or winters that lasted too long along the Rockies and the Oregon Trail around the year 1841. A healthy horse at that time could be worth $25 to $40. Deciding to kill one was almost always a final resort. People cut the meat into small chunks and dropped them into cast iron pots with water, dried onions, or whatever cornmeal remained at the bottom of supply sacks. The stew simmered for many hours until the tough meat slowly softened, but what made this meal so heavy had little to do with flavor. On the frontier, horses were transportation, property, and often the only way to continue moving forward. Because of that, there were suppers where almost nobody looked at one another for very long while eating. Number 7 was boiled rawhide, something appearing only when real food had nearly disappeared entirely. Around the year 1846, during brutal winters in the Sierra Nevada, traveling groups sometimes cut old saddle straps or pieces of rawhide loose, scraped them clean, and dropped them into boiling water. The leather simmered for hours until it softened and released enough gelatin to thicken the liquid slightly. If there happened to be a little grease or cornmeal remaining, people added it simply to make the mixture easier to swallow. There were moments on the frontier when hunger changed the meaning of almost everything. Number 6 was tallow candles. Around the year 1838, a small candle in western towns cost only 1 or 2 cents. But during long winters, people sometimes sliced them apart to use the final bits of animal fat in porridge or broth. Light and food began coming from the same object. Number 5 was rawhide and grease porridge, a thick meal slowly stirred with wooden spoons inside soot-blackened cast iron pots. Cornmeal was cooked into a very thin porridge before grease and softened leather were added to help the stomach stay full longer through the night. There were evenings on the frontier when a hot pot of porridge brought nobody happiness. But it was enough to help people survive until morning. The foods that kept the body from collapsing. After many weeks surviving on hardtack, smoked meat, and freezing wind, the human body slowly began changing in ways impossible to ignore. First, the legs felt heavier each morning. Then hands trembled slightly while tightening saddle straps. Eventually came the nights spent beside the fire while the cold still seemed to remain deep inside the body. Frontier people of the early 19th century did not know the word vitamin, nor did they understand the human body the way modern medical books would later explain it, but they remembered very clearly what it felt like when strength slowly drained away. And they also remembered that some foods restored the body faster than others. Number 4 was fresh liver eaten against exhaustion, something commonly consumed immediately after hunting throughout the northern Rockies around the year 1837. Before the animal had even fully cooled, the liver was already cut free and carried beside the fire. People sliced it into pieces, sprinkled coarse salt across the surface, and ate it while it was still hot. Some men had spent weeks without fresh greens or fresh meat, and only began recovering once warm liver and newly killed meat returned to their hands again. The smell of dark red liver mixed with cold smoke was not easily forgotten. It reminded people that on the frontier, some foods were never meant to taste good. They were preserved because the body needed them. Number 3 was rich bone broth filled with fat, something that rescued countless freezing nights through its warmth alone. Around the year 1835, cattle or buffalo bones at many meat markets cost only 2 to 4 cents because the best cuts had already been removed. But frontier people understood perfectly that marrow, grease, and the final traces of flavor remained hidden inside the bones. They cracked them apart, dropped them into deep cast iron pots, and simmered them for hours beside low fires. Fat slowly rose across the surface while steam fogged the insides of old tin cups. There were nights on the frontier when people survived because of one single cup of hot broth held between frozen hands. Number 2 was hot cornmeal porridge mixed with grease, the meal ending countless evenings inside low-hide tents around the year 1836. A pot like that usually costs only 4 to 6 cents worth of cornmeal and whatever fat remains inside tin containers. People cooked the meal slowly before stirring hot grease into it at the very end, so it would hold warmth longer and keep the stomach calm through the night. When the smell of melted fat drifted gently upward through the dark tent, entire groups usually grew quieter than before. There were suppers where simply having something hot was enough to make people believe they would survive until morning. Number 1 was tea brewed from bark and wild leaves, a dark drink passed from hand to hand while wind screamed through the cracks of tents. Around the year 1838, when real coffee and tea became too expensive at distant trading posts, many groups began gathering wild leaves or strips of bark and boiling them slowly in hot water to create a faint bitterness and one final warmth at the end of the day. People still needed something hot to close out long journeys. And sometimes, one steaming cup during a freezing season was enough to keep the spirit of an entire camp from collapsing before the body finally gave out. The fire has burned much lower now than it was at the beginning. Red coals rest deep beneath gray ash, only occasionally releasing a faint cracking sound into the cold night. A tin cup beside the fire still carries a thin layer of hardened grease around the rim. An old knife lies motionless across a wooden table scarred with cuts, and the leather journal, darkened by years of smoke, has been opened to its final page. After 25 meals, the thing remaining inside this small tent is not the feeling of a full stomach. It is the feeling that people once learned how to survive with very little in their hands. The foods that passed before us tonight were never created to impress anyone. They did not come from brightly lit kitchens or menus written beautifully on thick paper. They came from cornmeal resting at the bottom of cloth sacks, from fat guarded more carefully than sugar, from smoked meat hanging near tent roofs heavy with smoke, and from pots of broth simmering for hours against freezing wind. Some meals were made to travel for weeks across plains where no towns could be seen. Some appeared when game animals vanished from familiar hunting grounds. Some were eaten only during winters that lasted too long, when hunger slowly began changing the way people looked at everything around them. And some were so simple that many modern people would walk past them without a second thought. But for frontier mountain people of the early 19th century, those rough meals once represented the distance between continuing forward and collapsing beside the trail. Out on the frontier, food was never simply food. It was warmth that kept hands from trembling in the morning. It was what gave a man enough strength to pull a saddle across several more snow-covered miles. It was the pot of porridge sitting in the middle of the tent. So everyone knew there was still something left to share before sleep. The leather journal rests open across the firekeeper's knees for a few moments longer. The old pages carry the smell of smoke, deerskin sleeves, and faint grease stains left behind by countless nights cooking beside red coals. Inside are pemmican, hardtack, smoked meat, roasted roots, and even the foods many people today would rather not remember too clearly. But every hurried line written inside that journal stands as proof that people once lived among the cold plains, the winds of the Rockies, and winters that seemed endless, surviving through determination far stronger than the few things they actually possessed. Then the old leather journal is closed slowly once more. Smoke still clings to jackets, hands, and the freezing air outside the tent. But those meals remain somewhere inside the memory of old America, an America of low fires, dark wooden tents, and people who once learned how to keep one another alive, with whatever little remained before them.